Hello. So a bit ago, I was recommended an article from a D&D website called Don't Give Your Monsters Class Levels. That's what the article is called, not the website. Now, 5th edition has a mechanic in the Dungeon Master's Guide for giving monsters class levels. What you do is you take the monster, the stat block from the monster manual, or from wherever you're getting the stat block. It doesn't have to be, like a monster, just anything that's not a player, right? And what you do is you take the existing stat block and you just add class abilities onto it, and extra hit points. It's a way to buff monsters so that you can still use lower level stuff against a party that is not low level anymore. Anyway, the headline of the article, right? Okay, there are people with leaf blowers outside, and I don't like them. If you can hear that, that's what that is. So the article is titled, or headlined, Don't Give Your Monsters Class Levels. I assumed that by give your monsters class levels, they mean the thing that I was just talking about, where you actually take a monster and give it class levels. But that's not what the article is actually about. And if it was just a clickbait article that's not about what the headline says, fair enough. But it's also just a really bad article, and I'm bored, so I'm going to talk about it. The way it starts off is, time and time again, I've seen posts all over about GMs asking for advice on how to build a monster with player rules. So, for the record, up front, my advice on doing that is whatever challenge rating you're looking for, quadruple it. And that's the level of what you should be building. I'll get into why that's my advice later, and I'll give a disclaimer now that I haven't done that, so I don't know if it works yet, but I have way better reasons to think that it would work than this guy has to think that it won't. So let's go forward. The author of the article says they want to create an NPC who might be a fighter or a druid or a wizard, and they fall back on the player-facing rules of Dungeons & Dragons. There can be a variety of reasons for why someone would do this. So basically what the first half of this sentence is saying is, oh yeah, sometimes people want a druid NPC, so they make a character using the druid class. There's a variety of reasons for it. The conclusion they draw from this is that it only leads to misery either for the players or the GM. Using the player rules to build an NPC can't work, is the thesis statement of this article, which is just not accurate. Like, if you've run a game before, you should know right off the bat that that doesn't parse. But their support for their thesis statement is that there are a ton of reasons as to why you shouldn't build monsters with class levels. Some are flavor and others mechanical. That's a comma splice, by the way. Subheading, the flavor problem. One of the biggest problems, in the writer's opinion, is that monsters should be as unique as adventurers. Now, this presupposes the premise that adventurers have to be unique, which is entirely setting dependent, but let's move on here. The writer says, I don't like having adventurers with the same class in a party, and I don't allow adventurers with the same subclass in a party. Now, there is a flip side to this sentiment, and that is that I know GMs who very much enjoy running games with every party member being the same class. Now, adventurers with the same subclass might not work as well, but it's also not the most meaningful choice you can make about a character. And that leads directly into the writer's next point, which is there are very few meaningful choices a player gets to make. The argument that there are very few meaningful choices a player gets to make about a role-playing game, your class is probably the least interesting thing about your character. I'm probably gonna cut that. Not the disgusting throat-clearing noise, the anecdote about character building. The writer goes on to say, Dungeons & Dragons assumes that player characters are unique and separate from the rest of the world. They aren't the average peasant, as they have exceptional ability scores, hit points, and abilities. They are capable of taking on challenges that mere commoners are unable to, and this takes the form of their class features. A fighter class is not just any regular person who can fight. It is specific to the character and their place in the world. Anyone can pick up a sword, but not everyone is going to get second wind just because they're proficient at swordplay. Instead, that feature is what makes that character unique and special from others in the world. So this is half of a correct point misinterpreted. The idea that the player characters are exceptional compared to the rest of the world is, yes, a system assumption, although it's kind of world-building baggage that a lot of dungeon masters can decide to ignore. So, from the start of the game, you can just decide that that's not the case, and this is an article for dungeon masters. The players aren't the ones designing monsters, right? So, Dungeons & Dragons assuming something does not mean that you have to do it. Now, the players not being the average peasant and having all this cool stuff that isn't in the commoner stat block, yes, that's accurate to the mechanics of the game. The sticking point is the end of this paragraph, where the second wind example leads into, instead, that feature is what makes the character unique and special. No, your character should feel set apart from the rest of the characters in the world just by the fact that you designed the character and the DM didn't. The fact that you can use a bonus action to regain some hit points is not a character trait. That doesn't set you apart from anyone, that's just a game mechanic. The writer is arguing that when a character takes their class, it's how they differentiate themselves from the world, but the classes are part of the world. That is why so many of the subclasses have such specific flavor. Bard colleges are supposed to be an actual institution that exist in the world. A character class in D&D is a combination of mechanics and world-building information. The rest of this paragraph is, if everyone in the world is contained within 13 classes, then characters aren't unique or special. Instead, they're just part of the 7.69% of the population that has chosen that class. Not so special anymore. First of all, the fact that you're using the number 13 here would not apply before the Eberron book released. So this is just going to keep increasing as new classes come out, which means this percentage is going to keep decreasing. You know, less and less people are going to have overlap with the skills of the player because there's more classes. But also, that's not even how this works. There's a logical disconnect here. Using player classes for some NPCs in no way implies that every person on the planet has a character class. That's an absurd leap in logic. When the players go talk to this ancient skilled wizard in the ancient skilled wizard tower, the fact that that guy has wizard levels doesn't mean that every town guard is a level 20 fighter all of a sudden. The town guards are still just dudes with maybe the knight stat block, maybe the veteran stat block, depends on, you know, what you're using them for. It is not, oh, well, one NPC has a player class, therefore all NPCs have one of the player classes. That doesn't follow. So the next subheading is the question, what do classes mean to the world? Everything in this paragraph is accurate, but it's also completely useless information. The writer says, classes are merely a construct of us playing a role-playing game with a class system, which is a tautology. Character classes exist because the game has character classes. It doesn't exist in the fiction of the world your players travel in, just as we don't have classes in our world. Except, you, as the dungeon master, you don't have to listen to this. That's not an objectively true statement, that is a world-building decision. You, as the dungeon master, can say, actually, yeah, character classes are a specific defined thing in the world. There are reasons that it actually makes sense to do that. Druids are implied to have some sort of overarching organization because of the flavor text of druid circles. Rogues are implied to have some sort of overarching organization because the Thieves' Cant bonus language works always. It doesn't matter where your rogue is from. You know Thieves' Cant because you are a rogue. This is a comma splice. The article hasn't yet given you a valid reason not to just take the goblin race that's available to players and the wizard class that's available to players and say, well, that's a goblin wizard. They start trying to do that here by saying, if you start giving monsters class levels, they are no longer unique, which is a fundamentally subjective argument, and considering that players are picking their class out of a pre-written book that all the other players have access to, I mean, I, as a player, have never felt the class that I'm picking is something unique and special that only I have access to, because it's in a book that everyone is building their character with. This argument is that we need to conserve something that doesn't exist in the first place. The concluding point of this subsection is that if everyone is forced down the same paths, all learning bardic inspiration as soon as they pick up an instrument, which, cool, yeah, I can gain instrument proficiency from picking a background, that doesn't give my fighter bardic inspiration. If everyone is forced down the same paths, then it makes it so that individuals and the world itself operate by very clear rules. That comma shouldn't be there, removing a lot of the magic from the fantasy game. Let me take this opportunity to link a video in the top right corner about the difference between a hard magic system and a soft magic system. Because what you are arguing here is that hard magic is not fantasy, and you're wrong. Let's move on to the mechanical problem, allegedly. The author says, while I obviously don't like the idea of monsters being given class levels, and yes, that is the entire argument prior to here in the article. This much of the article is just, don't do this because I don't like it. What isn't a personal preference, the writer argues, is that the mechanics of 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons doesn't support monsters with class levels. So, the mechanics doesn't support it. The mechanics don't support it, is the argument being made, and it's not correct, because there is an entire section in the Dungeon Master's Guide specifically on how to do this. I'm saying a lot of stuff that doesn't really make any points, but so is the article. So we're gonna skip a bunch of this. Okay, take the veteran stat block for an example. They get 3 attacks, and they are only a CR3 creature. Compare that to a level 3 fighter, who only has a single attack. This is where their mechanical argument falls apart. They are trying to compare a CR3 creature to a level 3 fighter. A CR3 creature is meant to face a level 3 party. 4 creatures that are all level 3. The CR3 veteran stat block gets 3 attacks. The party at level 3 is 4 creatures that each get 1 attack. The veteran is in fact weaker than the party. So I've read this article, and a lot of it is padding. I'm pretty sure they had a word count that they had to meet. At first, I was reading through and responding to all of that, and I don't want to put all of those responses in the video because they're basically wasting time. My main problem with this article, and the main problem with this article, is that the author doesn't know what they should be comparing. They think that the challenge rating of a creature is equivalent to the same level on one character. That is just not reasonable. Let me give an example, right? Someone operating a circular saw, if you want to make a fair challenge for a level 4 party, a very direct way to do that is to make another level 4 party. 4 creatures, each is level 4, against 4 creatures, each is level 4. They have, in theory, the exact same power level. That means that if any one of those creatures were to fight the entire other party, they would probably be outmatched by a factor of 4. Thus, if you want a single enemy that will rival your entire party, and your party is level 4, that's 4 players times 4 levels for 16 total levels, so you should be looking at an enemy that is at least level 16. And probably not a spellcaster, because you don't want to be casting 8th level spells on a 4th level player. But that's besides the point. The point is that you are trying to make mathematical arguments with faulty equations. You're saying, look at this, challenge rating 3 isn't equal in power to level 3. And you're correct. Good job. Nobody thought that. Challenge rating 3 is equal to 4 level 3s. When building a monster, think of ways that it can survive being outnumbered. The monster building advice in this article is generally sound. This whole section is a very detailed edge case of, hey, if the thing that you're making as an enemy has spells, then the spells are a balance consideration. And yes, but yeah, if the class that you're picking for the enemy you're making isn't one of the spellcasting classes, this entire section doesn't matter to you. And again, you have to consider what spells they're using when you balance the encounter is not a valid argument in support of don't give your monsters class levels. It's just saying, hey, here's something to keep in mind when you give your monsters class levels. So, the end of the article is a subheading that reiterates don't use class levels. It reads, in essence, when designing a monster, don't use class levels. When I'm designing a monster, a lot of the time, it's not something that I even consider putting class levels on, because it's something like a giant with gigantism. Just because I thought it would be funny to have a size category that's so big, the individual body parts have size categories. Nothing about that screams, oh yeah, give it class levels. And also no other stats. This article is overall a waste of time that is arguing a point that it doesn't even understand, and it fails to even argue that point. The article is arguing, literally, never give class levels to any monster for any reason. I haven't read out loud, word for word, everything that's in the article, but that is the point they're trying to make. And again, 5th edition, the Dungeon Master's Guide has a section that tells you how to add class levels onto a stat block to buff a creature that already exists, not as a way to design an enemy from scratch. And then this last paragraph returns to the beginning of the article in arguing essentially that the flavor of classes should be unique to the individual player that chose that class as a world-building rule, and I don't agree with that. But more importantly, I would like to counter this entire article with advice of my own. Do use class levels when using monsters. Specifically, you can take monsters that are a lower challenge rating than your party is equipped to deal with, and you can buff that monster by adding class levels to it, and at the same time as raising it to the proper challenge for your party, you're going to give it abilities that the party, who may have read the monster manual, don't know that it has. And this is supported by the rules of the game. It's literally in the book that is for Dungeon Masters. Anyway, if you like Dumpstat, the website that this article is hosted on, you can support them on Patreon. I'm done with this video. Goodbye.